Somewhere on the rocky hills of southern Greece, behind walls so massive that later peoples believed only giants could have raised them, there stood palaces that ran the entire Aegean world for centuries. Literate, organized, fabulously wealthy, and then burned, abandoned, and forgotten so completely that for nearly 3,000 years, scholars dismissed the whole Golden Age as myth. The textbooks will tell you these people collapsed around 1,200 years before the Common Era and simply vanished, fading into legend until their citadels were finally dug out of the soil. For a long time, that was the story. Then ancient genetic material was extracted from their bones. And when the results came back, the story did not hold. The Mycenaeans were not made of what scholars had assumed, and stranger than that, they never actually vanished at all. To understand what the DNA overturned, you first have to understand what it was overturning. Before the Mycenaeans, there were the Minoans. On the island of Crete, a maritime civilization had risen to dominate the trade and culture of the Aegean, a sea power so far-reaching that scholars still argue over how much of it was empire and how much was influence. A coalition of kingdoms appears to have answered to a single leader, a title later condensed into the memory of a mythical tyrant. Then Crete faltered, weakened by some combination of natural catastrophe and hostile arrival, and the mainland Greeks seized the opening. By roughly 1,400 years before the Common Era, the Mycenaeans had eclipsed their former rivals and taken command of the Aegean for themselves. What they built was not a single empire, but a loose confederation of kingdoms, each centered on a fortified palace. Mycenae itself, Pylos, Tiryns with its colossal walls, Thebes, Athens, Argos. At the top of each sat the Wanax, a figure who was priest, king, and economic overlord, all at once, controlling religious ritual, the management of the economy, and the conduct of war. Beneath him stood his second-in-command, the leader of the people, and around him an entourage of chariot-borne nobility who formed the heart of the military and the state. These were not simple warriors. Inside the palace walls, scribes recorded the workings of the kingdom in obsessive detail, tracking weapons, perfume, olive oil, and textiles on clay tablets, written in an early form of Greek. When that script was finally deciphered, scholars had hoped to read the deeds of heroes, the campaigns, and pronouncements of an age of legend. Instead, they found tax receipts and ledgers, the bureaucratic bookkeeping of a civilization that counted everything. The palaces traded across the known world, exchanging emissaries with the Egyptians, the Hittites, and the kingdoms of the Near East, treated by the great powers of the day as a force to be reckoned with. And then, around 1,200 years before the Common Era, it ended. The palaces burned. The scribes stopped writing. The intricate system that had recorded every jar of oil and every measure of grain simply ceased to exist. The citadels fell silent. The great walls were left standing empty, and the civilization that had ruled the Aegean for centuries dissolved into the soil. For thousands of years afterward, the story of these people survived only as legend, a golden age of heroes too grand to be believed, until the ruins were finally pulled from the ground and the myths turned out to be memory. But that entire story, the rise and the fall and the vanishing, was assembled from pottery, architecture, and clay tablets. It was written before anyone could read the bones. Ancient DNA analysis is exactly what it sounds like. Scientists extract genetic material from skeletal remains that have lain in the ground for thousands of years, sequence it against the genomes of people living today, and assemble a detailed biological portrait of who the dead actually were, where their ancestors came from, and how they connect to the populations still walking the earth. It is, in every meaningful sense, a time machine made of bone. For most of the time the Mycenaeans were studied, this was impossible. The technology did not exist. Scholars reconstructed these people from the shape of their pottery, the layout of their palaces, the bureaucratic shorthand of their clay tablets, and the long shadow of the myths that remembered them. They built careful theories on painted vessels and burned citadels. They were doing the best they could with the tools available. But the bones themselves, the actual record of who these people were in their flesh, sat unread. Then, in the second decade of this century, a team of researchers led by the geneticist Iosif Lazaridis and his colleagues achieved what no one before them had managed. They recovered readable genetic material from Minoan skeletons on Crete and from Mycenaean skeletons on the Greek mainland, and for the first time the Golden Age could be examined not through its artifacts, but through its blood. The first finding was quiet, and it dismantled an old assumption almost without effort. Both the Minoans and the Mycenaeans drew the overwhelming majority of their ancestry from a single deep source. The Neolithic farmers of Anatolia, the early agricultural peoples who had spread westward into the Aegean thousands of years before any palace was raised, who had cleared the first fields and planted the first crops on those same hills. The builders of the Cyclopean walls were not exotic newcomers. They were not a conquering foreign race descending from somewhere far away to impose civilization on the land. They were, overwhelmingly, the descendants of the people who had farmed Greece since the dawn of agriculture itself. This mattered more than it might seem. For generations, some had imagined the architects of Greek civilization arriving from elsewhere, a superior people sweeping in to build something the locals could not. The DNA said otherwise. The Mycenaeans were rooted, biologically continuous with the soil they ruled, grown from the same ancient stock as the land around them. But when the researchers laid the Minoans and the Mycenaeans side by side and compared them directly, the two were not the same. They shared that vast Anatolian foundation, yes. Yet the Mycenaeans carried something the Minoans almost entirely lacked. Something extra, something that had come from outside. The extra ingredient was small, but it was unmistakable. When the researchers measured the Mycenaean genomes against the Minoan ones, they found a component in the mainland, people that the islanders almost entirely lacked. A second strand of ancestry layered on top of the deep Anatolian foundation that traced back to populations far to the north and east, beyond the Aegean, beyond Anatolia, out onto the vast grasslands of Eastern Europe and the Eurasian steppe. This was not a large share of the whole. The Mycenaeans were still, in the main, the descendants of ancient Aegean farmers. But the steppe-related signal was real, it was consistent, and it was present in the very population that rose to dominate the Greek mainland and command the sea. It was the kind of finding that does not announce itself loudly in the data. It is a minority ingredient, a thin additional line in the genetic portrait. And yet it was precisely the line that separated the conquerors from the conquered, the mainland power from the island civilization it had eclipsed. The signal pointed in a direction. That is the crucial thing about ancestry of this kind. It does not simply tell you that a population is mixed. It tells you which way the mixture points on the map. And the Mycenaean signal pointed away from the Mediterranean entirely, north toward the hunter-gatherer lineages of Eastern Europe and the herding peoples of the open steppe, thousands of miles from the olive groves and palace citadels of southern Greece. Something had come in from outside. Not a flood, not a replacement, not a wholesale overriding of the population. Something more subtle than that, and in its own way more interesting. A strand of ancestry that did not belong to the Aegean had entered the people who would build the Cyclopean walls, and it had done so before they became the Mycenaeans at all. The genetic foundation of the Golden Age was not a single inheritance, it was a blend, and one of its ingredients had been carried in from somewhere far away. In archaeology, a signal like this almost always means the same thing. It means migration. It means that at some point people moved, that bodies traveled across the map carrying their genes with them, and that when they arrived, they mingled with the population already in place and left a permanent mark in the blood of everyone who came after. The only questions were when it had happened and where exactly those newcomers had come from. And when the researchers traced the steppe signal back to its source, it turned out to connect the Mycenaeans to one of the largest and most consequential movements of people in the entire history of Europe. The grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, stretching from the plains north of the Black Sea eastward into Central Asia, were home in the Bronze Age to peoples who lived by herding and mobility, and who at a certain point began to move. Over centuries, populations carrying steppe ancestry spread outward in nearly every direction, west into the heart of Europe, east toward the mountains of Asia, and south toward the warmer lands of the Mediterranean. It was one of the largest movements of human beings the continent had ever seen, and it reshaped the genetic map of Europe so thoroughly that nearly every population living there today carries some trace of it. The Mycenaean signal connected directly to this great dispersal. The thin northern strand in their blood was a fingerprint of the same expansion that had transformed Europe, arriving in the Aegean and mingling with the ancient farmers already rooted in the soil. And it carried with it more than ancestry. For the steppe migrations are also the leading explanation that scholars have for one of the deepest puzzles of the ancient world: how an early form of the Greek language, the tongue eventually recorded on the clay tablets of the palaces, came to be spoken on those hills at all. The languages of this family, the broad group that would later include Greek, are widely believed to have spread outward alongside the people of the steppe, carried on the tongues of migrants rather than evolving in place. If that is correct, then the same movement that left its mark in Mycenaean blood may also have delivered the ancestral form of their speech. The newcomers brought genes, and they very likely brought language, and the two threads wound together into the people who would one day write their bureaucratic ledgers in the earliest Greek we know. This reframed the Mycenaeans entirely. They were not the pure inheritance of a single ancient source, a civilization grown unbroken from one root. They were a fusion. The deep foundation of Anatolian farmers who had worked the Aegean since the dawn of agriculture, overlaid with a steppe-derived layer that arrived later, on the bodies and in the mouths of people from far away. The Golden Age was a hybrid, forged from a collision of populations separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, brought together on the same southern hills. It was a more complicated origin than the textbooks had imagined, and a more interesting one. But the genuine shock buried in the data was not about where the Mycenaeans had begun. The deepest surprise was waiting at the other end of their story, in what the DNA revealed about the moment the palaces burned and the Golden Age came to its end. Around 1200 BCE, the world the Mycenaeans belonged to began to come apart. It did not happen in one place or to one people. Across the Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean, a bewildering series of disasters fell upon states that had stood for centuries, and within a few short decades, many of them contracted, fractured, or collapsed entirely. The great powers that had exchanged emissaries and treated one another as equals were swept into a crisis that historians still struggle to fully explain. It was not a single blow. It was a cascade, one failure feeding the next, until much of the civilized world of the Bronze Age lay in ruins. Moving through that chaos, named in the records of those who suffered them, was a mysterious group remembered only as the Sea Peoples. Who they were, where they came from, and what drove them remains genuinely uncertain. They appear in the sources as raiders and migrants, a force that descended on coast after coast in a time of upheaval. And the Mycenaeans seem to have stood on both sides of the phenomenon at once, counted among its victims in some places, and it appears among its participants in others. Some scholars have traced a connection between these wanderers and the people remembered in later ages as the Philistines, though that thread, like much of the era, remains contested. Whatever the precise mechanism, the effect on the Mycenaean world was total. The palaces burned. One after another, the great fortified centers that had governed the Aegean were destroyed, and they were not rebuilt. The scribes who had recorded every measure of grain and every jar of perfumed oil set down their styluses and never took them up again. The early Greek script of the clay tablets was lost so completely that when Greeks learned to write once more, centuries later, they did so with an entirely different alphabet, borrowed from elsewhere. The intricate machinery of the palace economy, the wanax and his nobility, the armories and the workshops, the obsessive accounting of a literate state, simply ceased to function. To the textbooks, this was the vanishing. This was the moment the Mycenaeans disappeared from history, the instant the Golden Age guttered out and the heroes receded into legend. The citadels stood empty, the writing fell silent, and a darkness settled over Greece so deep that the very memory of these people survived only as myth, as stories of kings and warriors too magnificent to have been real. A whole civilization, by every account, gone. Except the bones tell a different story about what the word vanished actually meant. When the researchers turned from the ancient bones to the living, they found something the textbook narrative had never prepared anyone for. They compared the Mycenaean genomes to the populations of Greece today, the people farming the same valleys and walking the same hills, and the two lined up. Present-day Greeks carry the same genetic signature the Mycenaeans carried, the same deep Anatolian foundation overlaid with the same thin northern strand from the steppe. The blend that had defined the builders of the Cyclopean walls was still circulating 3,000 years later in the bodies of their descendants. The people had not vanished. They had never vanished. What collapsed around 1,200 years before the Common Era was not a population but a system. The palaces fell. The writing was lost. The wanax and his nobility and his obsessive accounting all dissolved, and the centralized machinery that had defined the Golden Age came to an end. But the men and women who had lived under that machinery did not disappear with it. They went on, they farmed, they raised children, they buried their dead, and they passed their blood forward across 100 generations to the present day. This is the reason nobody expected, because it is not a reason at all in the way the question assumed. There was no disappearance to explain. The mystery had been built on a false premise from the beginning. Scholars had spent centuries asking where the Mycenaeans had gone, when the truthful answer was that they had gone nowhere. They had simply lost the palaces, the script, and the kings, and kept everything else, including themselves. And there is a final turn to it, quieter and stranger than the rest. The Greeks who came after the collapse, who lived in the long dark age when writing was forgotten, told stories. They told of a vanished golden age, of mighty kings and walled citadels, of heroes who fought beneath the towers of a wealthy eastern city. They believed these tales described a lost people, a race of giants and demigods who had passed out of the world. They did not know that the heroes of those stories were their own ancestors. They did not know that the blood of Agamemnon's world was the blood in their own veins, that the citadels and the myths had been raised by people whose descendants were standing on the very same ground, repeating the legends without recognizing themselves inside them. The biological record they carried was the actual record of the Golden Age. The people who remembered the Mycenaeans as myth were the Mycenaeans, continued, and no one, for 3,000 years, had thought to look in the mirror. For nearly 3,000 years, the Mycenaeans were a lost golden age, heroes who fought at Troy, kings and palaces too vast to be believed, a people who burned and disappeared into legend. The DNA closes the loop the myths left hanging open. They were never lost at all. The mystery was never where the Mycenaeans went, because they went nowhere. They stayed exactly where they had always been, in the soil and the language and the descendants who kept telling their stories for 30 centuries, never once realizing that the heroes of those stories were their own ancestors. So the real question is not what happened to the Mycenaeans. The real question is why anyone ever believed a people could vanish while their own grandchildren were still standing on the same ground, speaking a descendant of the same tongue, repeating the names of kings who had been theirs all along.